Hi, everybody. This is Stephanie with Portland Audubon, and this is the third and final of our onboarding for Wildlife Solutions counselors. And today we're going to be talking about humane solutions calls or wildlife conflict calls, kind of interchangeable terms. I like humane solutions just because I think it focuses more on what we want people to take away from the call with us, but some people might know this concept better by wildlife conflict. Uh, okay, so the first thing is, what are humane solutions calls? And there's a lot of different types, but basically, humane solution calls are calls that we get from the public when they're struggling with something about how wildlife are impacting them. It could be raccoons getting into garbage cans, and that's making a big mess. That's very frustrating. It could be birds building nests in inconvenient or dangerous places. There are a wide variety of topics and reasons that people might call. In fact, this is one of the most varied, um, uh, these are some of the most varied situations that you're going to run into because one bird nest is not necessarily the same as another. An osprey nesting on the top of a power line and causing like a potential fire hazard or damage to infrastructure is different than a bird that's nesting in someone's hanging planter and they're concerned about watering their plants and potentially injuring the babies or scaring mom away. So these kinds of situations are really, really varied. Today, we're going to go over some general ways of thinking about them and thinking through the situations. But honestly, these actually take some research sometimes. There are still calls where I'll let a person know I'm going to call them back after I've had a chance to look into the situation for them. And also, some of them don't have cut and dried answers. So, a lot of what you're going to hear today are some different ideas because our job is to give people things to try and see whether or not it helps. And then we can try something else if that doesn't work. Um, Very often, true solutions to wildlife conflicts have to do with trying a couple different things and finding what is going to be the long term solution. Ultimately, people are frustrated when they're calling us about these types of things and they don't want to hurt the animal, or else they wouldn't have called us, they would have hurt the animal. And so it's just helping them to find those different methods of resolving the problem. So today, as we go through I'm going to show you different pictures and different types of calls you might run into throughout. And we're going to talk about some different solutions just to give you an idea of the breadth of things. So for the photos that I've got here, we've got a raccoon that's getting into garbage cans. Usually the easiest thing is to secure the garbage can lid with a regular bungee works fine just to secure the lid down so that the raccoon can't get it off. But there are also specially made bungees out there that are made to go over bigger garbage cans and things like that. You can also have latches. Some people will make little mini sheds for their garbage. It really depends what the problem is and how far you want to go. Personally, I think a cheap bungee cord is really nice and simple for most people. Uh, the other is this osprey that's nesting on top of the phone lines, and this is a big problem throughout our country where osprey live. And a lot of the solution has actually been to provide platforms for them where they actually prefer to build their nests, but that they can do so without potentially harming our infrastructure. So sometimes providing an alternative place to demonstrate the behavior they're trying to demonstrate is exactly the solution. All right. So, when we advise for humane solutions, the first thing is to listen really carefully and ask a lot of questions because we need to understand what the caller's calling about. This sounds like it would be a really simple thing, but a lot of times the calls we receive are something like, I need to know how to get rid of this animal. Um, and that on its surface might be what the person is asking for, but it's not the solution we're going to provide, right? We are not in the business of removing animals from the wild, and we're definitely not going to recommend killing that animal. But when we hear that, we know there's something going on here where they don't want this animal around, and our job is to ask the questions and find out why. What exactly is that animal doing? And sometimes the answer might be really nebulous. It might be that they're asking to get rid of that animal because it makes them uncomfortable to have that animal around. It might not be doing anything that's directly causing harm, but it's the idea of what it could do. And that's going to be a slightly different conversation than it is causing damage to my house. But both are concerns we want to address. So when you're asking these questions, you really want to get to the bottom of it. Sometimes both things are true. Sometimes there's damage, but really, there is some psychological or perception that is causing some of the problem as well. So the next question is then, what is the ideal outcome? We want to ask what the caller wants. And a lot of times they want the animal to stop doing what it's doing. And sometimes they might really want the animal gone. That might be their ideal solution. But we don't want to stop there. When we talk about ideal outcome, we also want it to be ideal from our perspective, because as we've talked about in the previous videos, Audubon does hold a stance and we are advocating for something specific, right? We are a conservation organization. We want to make sure that animals are treated humanely. And so when we look to solve problems, we want to give advice that is consistent with that as well. So again, even if the ideal outcome for the caller is something in particular, it may not line up with our ideal outcome. And I want you to make sure you're thinking about both of those things, because we need to find a way to either find a way to bring the caller to where we need them to be. And a lot of times that's by providing solutions that actually work for them. You can do that. It's actually not that hard to help someone understand how to live with a wild animal and help it to stop causing damage to what they're concerned about. But again, you want to know both of those things. You do need to know what natural history is at play, which means you actually need to know something about the animal that's causing the problem. That can be difficult sometimes, especially if the person calling knows that something is causing damage, for example, to the garden, but we don't necessarily know what animal it is. Is it a rabbit? Is it a squirrel? Is it moles that are potentially looking for worms and they're disrupting things? Or is it chipmunks digging up garden bulbs? Or is it rats eating vegetables? Because that totally happens too. And you may not know, and the caller may not know exactly what's causing the problem, but part of your job is to help suss that out so that when you make recommendations, they're going to work. Because unless your recommendations are guided by the natural history of the animal, then there's no reason to expect that they're going to be effective, because every solution that we're offering is based on altering an animal's behavior. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the future. And then you want to make your recommendations. Generally, recommendations fall into a couple different categories, but there's lots of ways of actually putting these things into action. So there is we can recommend that people tolerate the behavior. There are situations where an animal is present, and especially if it's not causing demonstrable harm, then tolerating its presence is really the best thing to do. There are also situations where it's going to be short term, and if you can reassure people about that, they're going to be more willing to put up with the inconvenience that they're facing for that shorter period. But we also want to make sure that we're not just dismissing people's concerns, because we want people to call us for advice. We want to provide them with solutions that actually solve the problem. So tolerance isn't always going to be the right way to go. There are many different sort of ways to avoid the problem. It might be removing things that are attracting an animal. It might be excluding them to prevent them from accessing a space. It might be using different methods to make it an unfriendly space for that animal to be in. And there are lots of ways of doing that we'll talk about in a bit. But all of those different solutions are based on what you know about the animal and what's motivating it to engage in the behavior that the person is calling about. Okay, so when we want to understand the problem, there's a lot of questions you got to ask. Again, type of animal can be tough. And I'm not necessarily talking about down to the species, although that can be helpful too. But we need to know, is this a bird that's like a woodpecker? Or is this a bird that's like a hummingbird? Because those animals live very differently, and there's gonna be very different solutions related to that. Another question, like another series of questions to explore is whether or not the animal is healthy or whether it's in need of help. Sometimes when people call about an animal that's acting abnormally, it might be acting abnormally because they haven't seen the animal act that way, but it's not actually abnormal. Or it might be acting abnormally because it's ill or it's injured. And so we always want to keep that in the back of our mind and ask some of those questions that we talked about last time about the wildlife rescue and how the animal's behaving and what you see the animal and sort of observations about its situation, because we can absolutely have somebody who's concerned that a bird is living in their garage and it's pooping on their car, let's say, but the bird can definitely get in and out and it's fine, versus the bird that's trapped in that garage. It might still be pooping on the car, but the questions and the solutions are going to be a little bit different in those two situations. You want to ask a lot of questions so you understand exactly what's happening, how long it's been happening, where, so you can kind of visualize the space. You could use photos for that. People can email you video even of the space that they're talking about. Maybe the animal is chewing something and it could be helpful to see what it's chewing and sort of what that looks like and where it is. And then just understanding what's already been tried, because a lot of times I think it can be easy to assume that people have or haven't tried some of the things that we commonly recommend. I think that we recommend certain things so often that it can feel like either that's super obvious or you can default to providing that advice. And so I just encourage you always to ask those questions first and make sure that you understand. And a lot of times it's nice to warn the caller and say, okay, I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions here. I just want to make sure I really understand the situation, and then go into it, just so that they know to expect that. Because it is a longer conversation than a lot of people think, especially when what they called about was, I want to live trap this animal and bring him to you so you can put him somewhere else. And I want you to tell me how to do that. Their expectation is a much shorter conversation than what you're going to enter into. But ultimately, you want to know what the caller's goal is. And you can help callers get there if they're saying, I just don't want this raccoon in my backyard anymore. Then you can ask, well, so when, raccoons often live neighbors with people without causing problems. Is this animal, is it defecating somewhere that's causing problems for you? Is it that it's, you have dogs in your backyard, you're worried they're going to fight? Like what are the concerns there? Why do you not want this raccoon there? Because we can help you with those specific goals, but the reality is, even if we take a raccoon away, there's other raccoons out there, and nature abhors a vacuum, and they will always come, because there's a reason that raccoon is comfortable or attracted to the place where it is living now. So if you take a raccoon out, it creates a spot for another raccoon, and one will fill it. Okay, so, and then our goals. Oh wait, I didn't talk about this little woodpecker. So this photo is of a flicker that is creating a nesting place in the side of someone's house. And that's super frustrating for people. Obviously, it causes damage to the side of the house and everything. But if you understand that the behavior that this animal is displaying is related to nesting, you're going to have some different solutions than if you were assuming that this is a woodpecker that is pecking the house in order to get to insects that it eats. Because those are the two of the three main reasons that a woodpecker will peck at a house, the third being to make noise to attract a mate. And so if it's actually causing damage, it's usually either nesting or feeding. And then this one, because it's a hole, it's a round hole, it's an entrance. He's making an entrance to have babies in there. So that's one of the reasons why asking these questions and knowing the details is really important, because if you didn't, for example, know that it was a hole as opposed to he's just pecking and causing damage, you might make different recommendations. A lot of times when we talk about woodpeckers pecking on houses to feed, the answer is you have termites or some other insect infestation or rotting wood, because that's where woodpeckers look for food. And so you need to address that underlying problem. It's already causing damage to your house. The woodpecker is obviously damaging it as well, but the woodpecker is not going to leave as long as there's food. And you don't want those insects or invertebrates doing damage to your house anyway. So you need to get someone out to look if there's water damage or something like that. Whereas if it's a nesting behavior, it's not going to stop. And it's also not necessarily indicative of an insect infestation. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense there, that when you ask these questions, there's a goal there. It's just that there are so many different situations, it's hard for me to give you real specifics. Okay, so again, Portland Audubon has some goals. We want to keep people safe, so we don't want to be recommending that people do anything that's really dangerous to them. That includes things like picking up bats or cleaning out rodent droppings without respiratory protection because of the zoonotic illnesses associated with those animals, which we talked about last time. But it also includes things like we want to recommend people be safe and not, you know, put themselves in dangerous situations like crawling up on the roof without, without help or without um, the right safety precautions. Um, so just keep that in mind, because a lot of people, like, we can't prevent people from putting themselves in a dangerous situation, but we do need to be aware of the advice we're giving and make sure that when we give it, we are clear that we're not recommending that people do something there that is dangerous to them. Um, we want we want people to coexist with wildlife. We want them to do that in a way that allows the wildlife to live its life in a healthy and safe way, and we want people to be able to live as well. We are not looking to force wildlife away from people or people away from wildlife in the urban setting, because wildlife has to make a living in the places that it can survive now. Um, Human development is expansive, and we really believe that there are ways to protect what habitat we have and to support a healthy ecosystem, even in places where people are developing the land. Um, and so when we offer these solutions, we want them to be effective for people, because we want people to understand and join with us in that mission, right? If it becomes that the problems that people face when they interact with wildlife are insurmountable unless they either just tolerate it or kill the animal, then we're going to keep those two extremes, right? And so we really do want to make sure we're offering effective solutions that are also realistically achievable by people who are facing these problems. So we want to provide answers when we can, is basically what I'm saying. Um, Okay, we want to preserve and protect native wildlife and habitat. We don't want to disturb active nests. We don't want to separate moms from their babies. We don't want to recommend the removal of native plant species. Those are the types of things that help support that healthy ecosystem in urban areas. And so giving space to wildlife, allowing, natural predator interactions to happen without intervention, allowing supporting native plants and preserving trees and things like that. Those are all things that we want to support. And then we also want to make sure that animals are treated humanely, that we're not allowing or exacerbating any suffering that's out there, and that we recognize that wild animals are and should remain wild. That we're not advising people to attempt to tame or domesticate um, or keep captive wild animals that belong out in nature, because it creates suffering for those animals. So when we provide advice, a lot of it is geared towards how do we allow animals to live their lives the way they are meant to live, the way their bodies are designed to. And so some people are going to ask questions like, well, how do I best feed the crows? And our advice is going to be, we don't advise you feed the crows. We'll talk about wildlife feeding in a little bit more detail, but in general, feeding wildlife causes a lot of problems for the wildlife. It causes problems for people. And in general, the best way to support the animals is to provide habitat for them, as opposed to giving them handouts of food, which are problematic. So this is a picture of a squirrel on a bird feeder, and it is a non-native squirrel. This is an eastern gray squirrel. And a lot of times we get calls about them because people, they scare off the birds, or they make a mess, or they eat all the food. And the reality is that to some extent, as long as you put food out, you can't control the animals that are attracted to it. You're going to attract anything that eats that food. And so part and parcel of putting out food for birds is that you're very likely to attract squirrels. And that's not something that's going to stop so long as you're feeding. There are some things you can totally do to reduce how much the squirrels are disturbing the feeder or eating the food. And there are additives like hot sauce, like there's a spicy receptors that squirrels have that birds don't. So there are some additives that can make the food less palatable. There are different types of seeds that attract squirrels more than others. So for example, thistle is super small. Squirrels don't really like eating it, but lots of birds like eating thistle. Whereas sunflower seeds, super easy and super attractive to squirrels as well as some birds. So changing the type of bird you're feeding for, or the type of seed you're feeding, can be helpful. And sometimes different feeders can be helpful, although squirrels are super smart and will figure out almost everything. But so there are some different things you can do to kind of control it. But one of the expectations you want to set there is that if you're putting food out and it's something that like a squirrel will eat, then it's important to understand that they're going to be attracted. Just like if you put bird feeders out and you create a concentration of birds, you're going to attract bird eating animals like Cooper's hawks and things. It's part of the way nature works, and so there's a number of different parts of that conversation, trying to offer some solutions, but also trying to encourage some tolerance. Okay, so you want to understand the natural history of the animal you're dealing with because it really matters. It can feel vague when we say just natural history. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of how it plays out, because ultimately you need to find out what species or what type of animal that the person is calling about, and that's the animal that you're going to need to know some natural history about. And it's hard to predict what natural history you need to know, which is why this is such a fun job to constantly be learning about wild animals, because you will have to read and learn a lot about different types of animals in order to provide this kind of advice. So here on the screen on the left side is a Canadian goose, or Canada goose, who's made a nest in the middle of a parking lot, basically. And one of the natural history things that you learn about animals, waterfowl like geese and ducks, is that they actually lay eggs kind of one or two at a time over a period of days, and they don't start sitting on them until all of the eggs are laid, because when they sit on them, they want to incubate them all so that they'll hatch at the exact same time, but they don't lay them all at the same time. So sometimes people will call us about abandoned nests, or just like, they'll think that something happened to mom. And it's possible sometimes things do happen to mom, but a lot of times it's that they actually only visit the nest to lay the eggs at first. They don't want to stay there, in part because they're not incubating, and also because they don't want to attract predator attention to it. So especially in places that are super visible, like parking lots, we get calls about abandoned nests that aren't actually abandoned. The other thing that can be the sort of other natural history piece is that although ducks and geese and things really prefer to have their nests pretty close to the water, we have an overpopulation here in Portland and in a lot of urban areas. And so they're forced to go further and further from the water in order to find a nesting site. And once they find a nesting site, which they deem is suitable, and again, it's probably not ideal considering their actual natural history in places that aren't developed, but they can make nests in a lot of places that we think are inappropriate. And then what happens is the eggs will all hatch at once, and then they make a trip back to the water together. And that can be long, and they might have to cross freeways to do it. And that's why we get a lot of animals that come in or are injured in the spring during that trek. But once they make it to the water, usually they do pretty well because they are all hanging out together at the water. Mom doesn't like, and at that point, mom can eat, babies can follow her, and they're usually okay. But where sort of the natural history part comes in is a lot of times people will call and say, well, what do we do once mom and her babies hatch? They're just going to be all over our parking lot. And the reality is, no, they're going to be with mom and they're going to leave. As soon as they're all hatched, they're going to all leave together. So you really only have to watch for that period of time and then hopefully protect them on their way to their water, or at least on their way across your property, because they're not going to come back. They're not going to be like hanging out in your parking lot. It's not like they're going to go to the pool for the day and come back. So that's kind of that's a couple ways that sort of nesting behavior plays out in how it impacts people. There's more to say about that, but we'll talk more about that in the baby bird class. And then the other one on here is a little simpler. This is a robin that's attacking its reflection. And a lot of times birds hit windows because they can't see the glass, or because they see the reflection of like trees and sky and they think they can keep going. In this case, the bird sees itself and doesn't realize it sees itself. It thinks it's another animal and it's territorial. So this happens in the spring a lot, especially with male robins, and they'll try to scare away that robin in the reflection, and they can't figure out why it won't, and they'll be really persistent about it. And people will call us either because it's making an annoying noise and it's just going on and it's been going on for a while, or because they're worried the bird's going to hurt itself, or both. And really, the thing you can do is remove the reflection. So sometimes you can cover up, like if it's attacking a mirror on your car, you can cover that over for a while until the bird loses interest and goes away. So you can also put the things we've talked about before about kind of dulling the reflection. So like you could do a soap wash or something like that, in order to reduce the reflection so the bird doesn't see itself anymore. Or you can put up with it for a little while, because really this should only, it's kind of a hormones thing. It's a breeding season thing, a nesting season thing, and so they don't do this forever. And sometimes that's all you need to let people know, is that this is a short-term thing. If it's attacking its reflection, it will stop doing that. But for now, it's just trying to scare that other persistent bird away. Okay. So when we talk about encouraging tolerance, I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier is that the concerns are still real. There's still a concern there. When we're encouraging tolerance of a behavior, usually we're not encouraging tolerance of let this animal destroy your house. That's not what I'm talking about. But coyotes are a good example of this. A lot of times people are just concerned that they're in the neighborhood, because they're predators and because they're worried that they will harm someone or something. And when we hear those types of concerns, I just want to make sure that we recognize that those are valid and they're real. They come from a place of sometimes really problematic myths that people believe. Sometimes there is actually a risk that people are considering. It might be a smaller risk than it might be a small risk, but for example, being worried that a coyote will eat or kill a pet is reasonable. Coyotes are usually not going to come near larger animals. They go after small prey, but they can definitely kill small cats and dogs when they're not supervised, which is another reason to keep pets supervised. And coyotes are pretty shy, so they're not going to come into like a supervised yard and pick off your dog while it's out going to the bathroom. But if you leave your dog out there and it's not a secured area, and you leave them out there all night and the dog has nowhere to go, like, you know, a dog house or something to go into, there's certainly a risk. They are predators. But I think a lot of times when we talk about coyotes and other animals that people are worried about, it's an inflated sense of concern based on things that they've heard. And so a coyote being in your neighborhood is actually not a new thing. One of the ways that you can help sort of dispel the myth that coyotes are not really here, people tend to believe that because they don't see them, they're not here. The reality is they've been living with them forever. They just didn't see them before. They just saw this one. So there are some ways that you can help people find some comfort in the fact that it's always been there and it's been okay. They haven't actually caused huge problems. The Coyote Project is something that OSU runs, and I think we helped start it or something. We're involved in it, but there's a website where you can actually go look and see you can report a coyote sighting, and you can also look and see where coyotes are in the Portland area, and you can see how widespread they are, and how how many there are with minimal problems. So that's one thing you can do. I think it's also helpful for people to understand the natural history behind the behavior that they're concerned about, even if we're going to make recommendations about how to sort of mitigate that behavior, because I think helping people understand why animals are doing what they're doing can take some of the feelings of that the animal might be malicious out of the equation. Sometimes people will assign, well, it's a terrible thing. It's coming after, this animal is malicious. It's causing destruction, or it's wanting to do something bad. And if we talk about what the motivations actually are and how it lines up with how the animal lives in the wild, I think that a lot of times it's easier to kind of take the emotion out of it, and help people understand that it didn't mean any harm, basically. A lot of animals, there's actually a benefit to their presence. So when we talk about bats, for instance, we definitely are concerned that we don't want people to be handling them and potentially exposing themselves to rabies, for example. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have bats near where we live. In fact, having bats in our neighborhoods is incredibly useful. It helps control, mosquito populations and stuff, which in turns help control disease spread that could affect us in other ways. Um, so there's lots of benefits to having different types of wildlife around. And one of the benefits is that wildlife is intrinsically valuable. Like, we believe that biodiversity and that sort of intertwined functioning of the ecosystem around us is part of what helps keep us healthy. And there's lots of ways that can be demonstrated, from keeping waterways safe and clean and not clogged with harmful algal blooms or things like that. That's all a function of the way that wildlife and native flora and stuff like that all interact. The prevention of erosion and stuff like that. All of those different components help create a healthier environment, and we benefit from that. So I just want to make sure that when we talk about the benefits of the wildlife, we're also not losing sight of the fact that just because if an animal doesn't benefit us directly in a really tangible way, doesn't mean it's not valuable. And the last thing I'll say about this is that sometimes it can be helpful to reframe things from a place of appreciation of wildlife. So if I had a woman call at one point complaining because an osprey was catching fish and eating it on her balcony, which is kind of gross. I'm totally on board with that. But ultimately, it was talking about how cool it was to be able to see a bird like that up close so frequently. And she agreed, and we talked about that a little bit. And it was sharing that appreciation for the animal that helped us find some common ground. And from there, we talked about, if there are some ways to kind of limit the damage being done and the mess that it's being made. But I think sometimes saying, if someone calls and says, hey, so I saw a coyote in my neighborhood this morning, you say, oh, that's really neat. Is it okay? Being your first response, like, was it a healthy animal? Oh, that's really cool. Sometimes providing your own perspective can actually help frame the conversation in a way that's going to be a little more successful in encouraging tolerance. Okay. But tolerance is not in and of itself sufficient. So we want to talk about some different conflict resolution strategies. Primarily, these are going to fall into 4 categories. We want to eliminate things that are attracting the animal to the place that it's causing the problem, if there are any things. We want to provide alternatives for it to express the behavior it's expressing, again, if that's possible. We want to, if possible, avoid creating the situation that is allowing the animal to cause that problem. And that might include excluding it from that space. Preventing it from accessing the space is usually the easiest way to avoid the problem. In the example of coyotes eating cats, preventing the cat from going out where the coyotes can catch it is a method of avoiding the problem. So that's another example. And then hazing and deterrence. There's a reason this is last on the list, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But when we talk about making something uncomfortable or unpleasant for a wild animal, that's hazing and deterrence. We're making it so that animal is more likely to move on and leave the area And we do use that, but there are some risks with it as well. None of these strategies is going to be effective totally on its own, or I would say it's rare that one of these strategies would be effective on its own. Usually you need to use a combination, and not all of them are going to be sufficient or even applicable to every situation, but these are kind of the categories. So this is a hawk that's killed a chicken, and when you talk about eliminating attractants, if you've got hawks that are predating on your chickens, you can not have chickens. That's usually not the answer that people are looking for, and I'd say it's not the one we're going to offer up first either. But eliminating the attractant, the thing that's attracting the hawk is the chicken, so we're not really going to have much success down that. Providing alternatives, we don't really want to feed wildlife, and you wouldn't want to, have chickens for the hawk to eat and chickens for the hawk not to eat. So alternatives for killing chickens isn't really going to work out either. So where we're going to succeed here is in avoidance and exclusion. It's providing places for the chickens to be where they can't be caught by hawks, whether they live there all the time or whether, you put them in there in the riskiest times of day or things like that. As you can try different things there, but really it's going to be about preventing the hawks from getting to the chickens. And the other thing that you can do sometimes from the hazing and deterrence standpoint is hawks are generally not going to take on really big birds or really aggressive birds. So sometimes people with large free range flocks will actually use domestic geese and sometimes even things like swans. Or turkeys, I think turkeys, not swans. They'll use these bigger, more aggressive animals as sort of not watchdogs, but as sort of flock protectors, because the chickens will have a big brother to kind of look after them. And it doesn't 100% prevent predation, especially if some of the chickens stray from the flock, but it's certainly more helpful. It's certainly an element that can be helpful. So that's an example of how it might play out. All right, so eliminate attractants. Usually the things that are attracting an animal to a space is either that it's looking for shelter, it's looking for food, or it's looking for nest sites. There are occasionally other needs and drives, which all is explained by their natural history. So when we talk about a woodpecker drumming in order to make a loud noise to attract a mate, that's really specific, right, to that animal, the way that animal lives its life. So if the need that's attracting it is this need to make a loud noise, then finding a way to muffle that noise is going to solve the problem, because you're taking away the thing that's attracting the animal to that place. But that, again, so many different really specific examples there. In general, it's shelter, food sites, and nest sites. Shelter, food, and nest sites. A lot of times when we talk about eliminating attractants, it's almost always food. Shelter is certainly something that you can control to some extent. So if you have a yard full of debris piles, like you've just got a lot of clutter around your yard, you're gonna have more places for example, rats to hide and move without being exposed, because they don't like to be just out in the open. So by clearing away those debris piles, you can actually make it so that those animals are less likely to be in that space. But it's tough, because a lot of times you're talking about shelter that's sort of there because of the way your house is built or the way your yard is set up. And so we'd have to talk about exclusion in order to really prevent animals from taking shelter there. Provide alternatives. So you might be able to provide another way for the animal to display the behavior that it's looking to display. Nest boxes are a good example. If you leave dead snags up, or if you put up nest boxes, you're not necessarily going to displace an animal that is already nesting or already made a nest. It's not going to necessarily move mid-season. But if you make a more attractive place for them to make a nest next year, they're less likely to investigate your house, for example. So again, it's not going to be sufficient all by itself, but a lot of times this is part of solving the problem long term, and also supporting animals that you want in your neighborhood. You just don't want them causing harm to your house. Woodpecker bongos are another example, is where you actually give them a place to drum where it makes a really satisfying sound. Then they're more likely to stop drumming on the place that is like waking you up in the morning. And then planting plants for the wildlife is an example from like gardening. So some people, when they plant their gardens and plan their gardens, they actually plan for some of it to be like they overplant or they choose certain plants specifically because they're going to sacrifice that to the wildlife that's living in their garden, with the idea that some of it's for them and some of that's for the wildlife. So although it's not exactly a one-to-one replacement, you're not necessarily going to protect your cucumbers by planting, some other plant next to the cucumbers. Certainly that concept of sharing your space can be helpful, uh, especially if you're planting like native plants and things like that, because then you're really making a difference for the habitat as a whole, as opposed to just that one particular animal. So I just thought that was a cool example. And then I would say just recognize that it's not always appropriate to encourage certain behaviors. Feeding is an example where if they're coming to your yard for food and they're causing a problem, providing an alternative food source somewhere else is still not really a good idea, because feeding in general causes some problems that we'll talk about feeding in detail in a sec, but also just because uh, you're then just moving the problem. You're not necessarily getting rid of it. Okay, so avoidance and exclusion tactics usually have to do with preventing access. So two examples on the screen right now is if a bird is nesting in a dryer vent. After that nest is done being active and you clean out that dryer vent, putting a dryer vent cap on to prevent the bird from accessing it again is going to prevent that problem from ever reoccurring. If you have a deck that's lifted off the ground and you don't want an animal like a raccoon nesting under there or skunks nesting under there, maybe they had babies under there this year and we got through that. Now we want to prevent them from having babies under there again. Then actually putting hardware cloth down beneath the ground a little ways and then out. I don't know if you can see it here, but it comes down and then it comes out horizontally a little bit as well. And then the ground is over it and it's all covered. Then you can prevent those animals from going under there again and you won't have that problem anymore. So exclusion is specifically about identifying like where the animals are accessing, how they're getting there, and then closing that off so that it is no longer an option for them. One of the things that's really important to remember for exclusion is that you don't want animals, live animals, trapped in, and you definitely want to be really careful around baby season because there could definitely be babies and mom might be able to leave. She may or may not be able to take her babies with her. And the last thing you want is a bunch of orphaned or abandoned babies that you've separated from their mother, especially as they could die from that. So one thing we very often recommend, and I'm going to pull up this YouTube video, give me just a sec to get it on the screen here. But one thing we really often can recommend is one-way doors that allow the animals to leave but not get back in. And that way, if there are live animals in there, they will eventually come out. So here's an example of a one-way door. Really, it's a homemade one-way door for some squirrels in an attic. And you can see that basically what it is it's some hardware cloth that's attached around the entrance the squirrels have been using. And then it's a single flap of hardware cloth that is hinged so that when they push out, they will then crawl and you'll see it in a sec once this little guy leaves. But they can't really lift it up to get back in because it's wide enough. They're actually standing on it. There are a variety of types of one-way doors. There are even some that are sold. But this type of thing works really, really well for a lot of different animals. You just have to make sure the flap is light enough that whatever animal is in there can get out. So certain birds aren't going to be able to push through a heavier flap like this, for example. But yeah, just one by one, they all come out and then they can't really get back in. And that allows them to find another place to live. The one-way door is not a permanent solution. They're going to have to actually seal that up more officially once they're sure all the squirrels are out. But you put a one-way door on for a couple days and then go actually explore your attic, make sure you're not hearing anything up there. Then you'll know that then you're safe to seal up that spot. And I thought there was part of this video where you actually get to see them trying to get back in. see if I can. Oh yeah, here. I'll just jump to this part. So the last one's coming out now. And then you can kind of see how they can try to get in. And it's not that they really couldn't, but they're squirrels. And their little squirrel brains can't necessarily figure this one out that quickly. All right. All right, back to our slideshow. Okay, so hazing and deterrence is, again, something we want to be careful with because we're purposefully making an animal uncomfortable. And some of these things can actually be dangerous. So you want to use them really intentionally and with safety of the animal in mind. But the other thing is that you can scare an animal away, but we always want to be sure that the situation is that scaring that animal away is appropriate. So for example, you need to be sure there's no babies left behind. Now, a lot of babies, if they're old enough, like older raccoons and their eyes are open and they're following mom, if you haze mom away from an area, she'll take her babies with her. And a lot of animal parents are really, really dedicated and they will actually try to relocate their babies. But if it is too uncomfortable or too scary for them to go back at all, then the parents will usually prioritize their own, well, they'll always prioritize their own survival and the lives of all the future babies they could possibly have over the babies that they currently have. And so you can definitely cause abandonment if you're not careful. So when we recommend hazing an animal away from an area, especially if it's got babies, usually we want to be a lot gentler with our tactics and stuff. So when we talk about making a place uncomfortable for animals, we do need to be specific about where and when we're trying to keep them away, because hazing and deterrence tactics are often effective short term, but long term they're not going to be effective. And they're usually effective for like specific spaces, not the entire yard. So you can get an animal to leave underneath your porch pretty easily. By using some of these different tactics, but you're not going to be able to prevent them from coming on your property at all, for example. And the other thing is that if you put up something like something that scares them away, it will usually only scare them away for a short time, because when we're talking about hazing and deterrence, one of the things we look for are deterrents that aren't going to actually harm the animal. And so it is something that they can become habituated to. They can stop having a fear response to over time. And so sometimes you have to use multiple things. Sometimes you have to change them out or rotate them. But long-term, no hazing option is going to be effective. You have to follow it up with like exclusion or something like that. So if what we're talking about is we want to get this family of raccoons to stop going underneath your deck, you can do that, but you're going to have to physically prevent them from getting back in eventually, because hazing is only going to work short term. It's maybe going to evict them right now, but eventually someone else is going to be like, oh, this seems like a really comfy den underneath here. There's lots of shelter and it's really safe. And they're going to try to use it as well. So exclusion is really the only long-term effective way to prevent an animal from being in a space. Same with your attic. Your attic is not going to be sealed from animals and it's not going to be animal free unless you actually close off the entry points and make sure the animals can't get in. But anyway, so you can use light. Usually safe shelter is going to be dark in the attic or under the porch or wherever it is. Adding a light like a work lamp or a floodlight or something makes animals feel more exposed. That's not going to be as comfortable. Sound, sometimes you can play radio, talk radio and things like that. People or animals don't really like hearing people talk. You can use scent. What this is, you got to be careful with things like ammonia and mothballs. They're really like noxious and they can really help encourage animals to move along, but they can also be toxic. So what this is a plastic, like a Glad container with a lid that's got some mothballs and cayenne pepper in it. And they're going to place that in the space so that it smells, it gets out the holes. The smell can get out the holes, but that the animal can't actually come into contact with the mothballs. And that's really important to prevent any potential toxicities. Predator simulators. So this is a picture of an example of something you can buy that has these big predator eyes on it that remind animals of like owls and things like that. There are effigies of owls. Some places will use like the screams of red-tailed hawks and things like that to basically cause animals to think that they're going to be predated on, which can deter them from being there. Those can be really effective, but again, usually only short term. So they're not going to be like a constant thing that works effectively by just having them in the same place forever. So if you did use an effigy, for example, you'd want to move it around. Um, Movement, so like hanging mylar streamers or things that flutter and flash, can also prevent animals from being comfortable there. That can be effective. For example, if you didn't want birds to come eat berries off of a bush, you might be able to get them away for a little while by having these fluttering, flashing things. They're frequently not going to work for like weeks. So maybe not the entire time you've got berries on there. So, you know, take what you can get, right? Um, you can also change the physical space so that maybe birds or animals can access it, but it's really uncomfortable to do so. A lot of places that don't want like pigeons perching and stuff will add bird coils or bird spikes, which basically make it hard. There's not really a flat surface to stand on. And then they just don't really want to be there anymore. And then taste, the only one I really know for taste is the hot sauce for the squirrels to prevent squirrels from eating the bird seed. Um, which again, varying effectiveness. Some squirrels don't seem to mind, but it is something that folks can try. So there's lots of options. There's probably more than this. One of the ones I want to mention is human disturbance. A lot of times, if people are concerned that an animal is in a place that it shouldn't be, actually having more people moving around that area and talking around that area is going to make it less attractive. So a lot of times, if it's like a shed in your backyard and they're underneath or behind the shed, if you use the shed more, the animals are more likely to relocate because they don't actually want to be near people. All right, so we're never ever going to recommend trapping and relocating as a solution because it's not an effective solution and it's also super inhumane. There's a couple reasons for that, and I mentioned before, nature will fill a vacuum. So if you take an animal out of your yard without addressing why it was there in the first place and what was attracting it there, another animal, usually of the same kind, will just take its place. It might take a little while before that happens, but it's definitely going to happen. And so it's really not a long-term solution to remove any one particular animal. You want to actually address the problem. But the reason that trapping and relocating, like that doesn't actually sound so bad, right? Maybe trap and relocate the animal and then deal with the problem. But it causes a lot of problems for that individual animal. And from like an ecological standpoint, it's really dangerous to do that. When an animal is taken out of its home territory and just plopped in another territory, it's either habitat that it can live in or habitat it can't live in. A lot of animals in urban settings, people will think, oh, I'll just take them to the closest wildlife refuge and just dump them there. That animal has actually lived its whole life in an urban setting. It may not be able to survive very well taken out of that setting. So that's one possibility. Another is that it's moving into occupied territory. It's unfamiliar with the territory. A lot of times they try to get back where they came from, which can put them in danger, both because there's a lot of obstacles in the way and it's a long distance, but also because they don't know where to get food, and how to survive in the meantime is going to be really difficult with predators and competing other animals that are like chasing it off their territory and stuff like that. Ultimately, animals usually die when they're relocated. Some animals do make it back, but they're in pretty bad shape once they make it back. A lot of them are starving and stuff like that because they've been relocated and just dumped. I mean, if you can imagine if you were picked up in the middle of the night and forcibly transported without your purse or credit card or anything and just dumped in some other city somewhere, or even worse, someone else's house, you might be able to imagine how disruptive this really is. But ecologically, it's also, there are really good arguments for not doing it. You cause huge population disruptions, especially if a lot of people are doing it. And then disease spread. There's actually been demonstrated examples of diseases being introduced into areas where they weren't before because someone picked up an animal and moved it there, thinking it was better. So it's actually really, really harmful to relocate wildlife. That's one of the reasons why at the Wildlife Care Center, we try to get animals back to their territory they came from when we release them, of several reasons, really. But one of them is that making sure we're not moving animals around the environment artificially is part of how we can keep the environment healthy. It's also illegal. You can't just relocate wildlife. But a lot of times, as we mentioned last time, legality is not always the most compelling argument, but it is illegal to relocate wildlife. Okay. The other thing that is not really a solution that we recommend is using removal companies or pest control companies. It's always best to explore alternatives, sort of do-it-yourself methods and things first. And we don't endorse any particular companies or programs. It's not that there aren't responsible companies out there, but many of them are not. For the most part, pest control and removal companies are going to come and either poison or kill the animals. So they may live trap them, but they'll usually remove them and kill them because, again, relocation is not legal. And often just removing the animal, as I mentioned before, is just a short-term solution, but there's not a real motivation to look at long-term solutions when your company is paid by controlling the situation after it's happened. So if if people are looking for removal companies, I think it's just important that, first of all, we aren't going to recommend a specific one. We're also a nonprofit, and recommendations and stuff are we just don't give those out. We don't endorse specific companies and stuff like that. But the other thing is just to ask a lot of questions about how they operate, because I think that that's really, if people want humane solutions and they're really focused on a pest control company, then they need to talk to one that's not just going to remove the animal, but is actually going to look at how are they accessing the space and like seal off those entry points and put together a long-term plan for control. And if they can't do that, then that's a sign that that's not a company that should be that you should engage. Excuse me. Okay, so there are a lot of different resources out there that you can use, but these are the three that I recommend. Living with Wildlife, Wild Neighbors, and Answering the Call of the Wild. Answering the Call of the Wild is my personal favorite. It's a little hard to get your hands on, and I know I mentioned this last week, but it is specific to the job that you're doing. Wild Neighbors is really a lot about this topic today, though. It contains a lot of information about sort of humane solutions and different options that people can try. And Living with Wildlife is pretty similar. It has a lot of those same things. It also has some good natural history information in it. So all three of these are great resources, and they're things that you're probably going to need to refer to. So you get a call about a problem and you talk to the person enough to understand the problem. Sometimes, and it's totally appropriate to do this, sometimes it's best to say, I'm going to need to do some research and get back to you. Just make sure you actually get back to the person. I don't know why my picture's not showing up, but it's not super important. So we want to talk a little bit about some tips about providing the advice, and then we're going to go over a couple specifics and we'll be done for the day. First, make sure you understand the situation. Again, assumptions are just really problematic, especially when you're talking to folks on the phone. So just go the extra mile and listen really carefully and ask a lot of questions so that when you are talking about solutions, they're tailored to the situation the person's calling about. Think of yourself as a collaborative expert. So people are calling because we have advice to give, we have valuable experience, you've had some training, and you have some resources to provide. So you are the expert in this conversation, but that doesn't mean that it's best to be really prescriptive. People are going to be a lot more willing to work on these problems with us and to get towards the solutions that we hope they will, like the decisions we're hoping they're going to make, if it's a give and a take. So asking things like, does that feel doable, and what do you think, and you know your space better than I do. Do you feel like this is an effective solution? is going to be really helpful. So make sure you're engaging with them in a conversation, that you're collaborating with them on the problem, because really they have a lot of knowledge that you don't have about the situation, about like their physical property and stuff. Use referrals responsibly. So part of that is like we're not recommending people go to pest control companies, but part of that is also not just shunting problems off to the next person. I really don't want you to say, if someone's like, I've got a coyote and it's a nuisance animal and I just want it gone, we're never going to recommend you try to call Fish and Wildlife and get it removed as a nuisance animal. That's just not where we're coming from. And it's also not what Fish and Wildlife is likely going to do. They're probably not going to do anything. The person's probably going to get lost in like a constant cycle of calling different people and leaving messages places. They're not going to get the help they need. We take responsibility for trying to provide the best information we can, but ultimately we aren't going to we're not going to refer people places when we don't believe that that's the right outcome. We're just going to give the best advice that we can. And if people are really insistent that they're going to find a way to do this, then that's something that they can pursue on their own. We're not going to help them do that. But we're also just not going to try to duck a hard conversation by saying you should call someone else. We are the right person to call if we're talking about wildlife issues in the vast majority of situations. Okay, no limits. So like, I guess I don't know for sure that all of you are not doctors, lawyers, and construction experts, but I know I am not. And so I want us to be really careful that we're not providing like legal advice and medical advice, and that we're not trying to help them rebuild their house. Sometimes it's appropriate. These are cases where it's appropriate to refer people on to experts in those areas. So if they're worried about a disease, let's say they're worried about rabies, you can talk about rabies and what you know about that illness and what you know about the risk in terms of it's in bats, and exposure usually happens through bites and things like that. But what I don't want you to do is to tell people, I don't want you to try to. I'll give you an example. We got a call last year from someone who was saying they were having respiratory problems, and they were saying that it was definitely caused by the birds that were nesting in their dryer vent. That's entirely possible. There could be respiratory response to a bird. People can be allergic. There can also be some illnesses that can be airborne. There's lots of different things, like just the contamination itself could cause irritation in the lungs. But there could also be a lot of other reasons that someone has respiratory illnesses. So we're not going to really go down that path with them. What we're going to say is you need to talk to your doctor about your medical concerns and about whether or not it could be caused by the birds. But what we can talk about is what to do to prevent birds from being in your vents anymore, or from having this problem with the birds. We can at least talk about how to exclude the birds from that space. So just keep in mind that there are lines. We don't want to be providing people legal advice either. Interpreting the law is a challenging thing to do in the best of times. The best we can say is there are some things that are not legal to do without a permit, and we're really not going to help you navigate the permit system, as we're not legal experts. If it doesn't work, call back. Basically, just always leave that door open for people to call us back. And especially with wildlife conflict calls, there are so many different options that if the first thing we suggest doesn't work, it doesn't mean that all hope is lost. There is usually something else we can try. So it's always worth trying us again. And it may not be the same person that the caller talks to, and that actually might be a good thing. Maybe someone else's creativity will help the situation next time. And the last is that there are some unwinnable battles. I absolutely want to recognize that, and also let you know that all I expect from you is to give out the best advice you can. In some cases, what people want and what we're able to offer are not compatible. And all I expect from you is to try to do your best to, to be polite, to be helpful, and also to hold fast to Portland Audubon's purpose, really. Okay, so wildlife feeding. I promised you we'd talk about this. Wildlife feeding is really not recommended. There's a lot of reasons for that. When people put out food for crows or for raccoons or for ducks at the park, in all of those situations, you're encouraging those animals to come and be comfortable near people, which can put people at risk if they approach the wrong people, and put the animal at risk if they approach the wrong people. It can really put animals in really vulnerable situations. There's been countless times where someone who's been feeding the crows brings me an animal that got shot by BBs because it was in a place and not keeping distance, and their neighbors finally got fed up with it. So it's, by creating this closeness with wildlife, we can create problems for the wildlife, and usually it's the animals that suffer in that equation. You can inflate the population abnormally high, which causes disease spread. It also tends to stretch resources and can cause ecological damage. For example, a lot of ducks, their population will boom because of all the food that's being provided, and that causes water quality problems, which then causes problems for native plants and fish, and also the ducks themselves. And then you tend to have disease outbreaks and stuff. So population imbalance is a huge issue. The food that you're feeding is not what these animals would eat in the wild. You would not provide bread. Their ducks don't have access to bread. You would not provide puppy chow. Raccoons don't eat puppy chow in the wild. Their bodies are designed to eat wild diets. And so when you provide these foods that then skew their diet away from the natural, you are creating opportunities for a nutritional imbalance. And again, it can just create nuisance problems for people, which then often result in actions that are taken to control that population, and that usually means killing animals. Bird feeders are not exempt from this list of problems. Bird feeders have many of these same impacts. And at the same time, if they're done responsibly, Audubon is not anti-bird feeder, but it is important that we encourage people to view habitat as the best solution for providing support for wildlife. So when people say they want to help wildlife, they want to see wildlife in their yard, the absolute best way to keep those wildlife healthy and happy and to attract them to your yard is to plant native plants and to set your yard up so that it is a habitat for that wildlife, as opposed to just putting up a bird feeder. That's not only safer, but it's also going to be supporting other types of like insects and beneficial insects and native insects and things like that are really important to our ecosystem. So always going to support habitat over handouts. But if people do feel the urge to have bird feeders, it is something that can be done fairly safely. Very often we do have periods in the winter where we have to ask people to take them down because of salmonella outbreaks and eye conjunctivitis outbreaks and things like that. But the one thing I want to stress here is that if people are feeding the birds, they need to be cleaning and disinfecting their bird feeders. And it's best to do it daily. It's best to put out only enough food for the day and clean your bird feeder every day. But some people will swap them out, have two identical ones, put one out, take one out, every day. That's best, but honestly, it's as frequently as people can do it. But I would not recommend more than a couple days in between cleaning, especially considering some of the outbreaks we've had recently. So yeah, feeding is a problem, and we're not going to recommend people feed wildlife in the vast majority of situations, bird feeders being the only exception. Okay, sometimes animals make nests in really inconvenient locations. Birds are protected by the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, so you really can't disturb them once they've made a nest and they have babies or live eggs in them. But you can remove the nests after the babies have left. So a lot of times it's just advising people to hold tight until the babies fledge. And remember that babies they leave the nest before they're fully flighted. So it's actually a fairly short period of time before they'll leave that nest. Often it's a matter of a couple weeks. So a lot of times it's just hanging in there until that happens. Since it is illegal to disturb a nest with live babies, sometimes that does impact things like construction problems and construction projects and stuff like that. We really can't recommend that people interact or to remove active nests because of that law that protects them. But sometimes animals will make nests in places that are really, really dangerous. And if it's something that's really unavoidable or has already happened, and some sort of disturbance has happened, a lot of times we can actually put up a false nest, put it in the same location or very close to the same location, and put the babies in, and mom can continue to visit. So we'll talk more about that in the baby class, but we don't recommend disturbing active nests. It usually only takes a couple weeks before the babies are gone. And if it's already happened, oftentimes there's an opportunity to reunite. Okay, animals can become trapped very easily in certain places. Swimming pools, because the edge is so sheer, window wells, sometimes chimneys. Sometimes there's animals actually living in chimneys, but sometimes they're trapped in there. And often we get calls about animals that are in like warehouses or big garages or even inside people's houses. A lot of times it's just providing them the ability to get out on their own. So you can do ramps, like a ramp covered with a towel for the ducklings to get out. You can use the like a skimmer to kind of get the ducklings out, because mom will usually be fine, but she leads them to the water, and they're all hanging out there, and then the babies can't get out, causes a problem. So sometimes it's just a matter of giving them a boost out. Window wells, a lot of times it's best to actually put a ramp in there permanently or put a cover over it so that animals can't fall in there. With chimneys, there are caps to prevent animals from falling into the chimneys. You want to make sure you're not capping in animals that are nesting in there, like chimney swifts, but there's definitely options for preventing animals from accessing the chimney next time. But when we talk about animals in buildings or in chimneys or things like that, and you actually do want to get them out, if they're physically capable of leaving, you provide them a way out. You make sure the way out is lighter than the surrounding area. So like open the door and then cover over the windows or close the shades and stuff so that they see that as the bright light, and the way out is the door. A lot of times you can put, well, sometimes you can put food or something that looks like food near the exit. So for hummingbirds, we'll put like red flowers or a hummingbird feeder or something right at the exit so that they are attracted there and then can leave. And then it's a matter of not scaring them away from the door. So not chasing them around and stuff like that, letting them calm down enough to see and make decisions about where they're going to go. When they're calmer, they're more likely to leave. There's lots of different things there that we could go deeper into, but there are options for getting trapped animals out of these places. A lot of times it's pretty low contact. If animals are ever entangled in nets or fences, if animals have been trapped for a long time, we do want to recommend that they come in though, because they're probably dehydrated. And in the case of netting and fences and stuff, they're often injured. All right. This is the last thing I wanted to go over, is just an example of going through this process. Someone is calling you because a heron is eating ornamental fish out of the pond. And so the thing they want the heron to do is to go away, but after some talking, they don't want to kill the heron. They really just want the heron to not eat their fish. That's what they want. And honestly, we want that too. We want the heron to be alive and happy, and we don't want it eating the fish, because that's what this conflict is all about. So when you're talking about like a koi pond, the natural history, obviously the animal's attracted by the koi, that's their food. And if you think about how a heron eats, it walks along the shore and then it eats the food that it can reach. It's not swimming, it's wading. So there's a couple different things that tells us. One of the solutions is potentially having a koi pond that is deep enough that it is too deep for the heron to wade in. They don't really like super deep water. They need to be able to stand up on the bottom and have their body well clear of the water. So having a deeper koi pond may or may not be possible, but that's one thing, is that when setting up koi ponds, it's a good idea to recommend deeper ones, or at least one with a deep enough spot that the fish can get away from where the heron can reach. The other thing is that what helps fish survive from herons in the wild, and that's cover. So when you have your koi pond set up, you want to make sure there's lots of places, like you can stack rocks and make crevices. You can put like even just a milk crate down on its side. You want a place for the fish to be able to retreat to when the heron is there, that the heron can't then reach them in, so that they feel safe and the heron can't get them. And then the last thing is that when a heron wades around in the pool, the way it moves and everything, you can also prevent it from from having free access to the whole pool. For example, if you run like a tight, you don't want this to be loose because you don't want animals to get tangled in it, but you can put monofilament line in a grid over the top of the koi pond. It's monofilament, so you can't really see it. It's that clear plastic line. It's nice and tight, so nothing's going to get all wrapped up in it, and the heron won't be able to wade through it because there are these this barrier in the way, if kind of like a net. So sometimes you can stretch that over the top to prevent the bird from getting in there at all. So those are a few different ways of preventing access and sort of removing that attractant. The bird will definitely know the fish are there, but if it can't get to them and they can get away from it, then you're going to prevent this problem from reoccurring. And that's all I have for you guys today. So thank you so much for joining me today. I know that this is just a brief dive into the world of wildlife conflicts, but I hope that it was helpful, and I hope it gives you some tools for the calls that you receive. So the final and last step in your introductory training before you can get on a shift with your mentor is to complete the quiz. We'll send you a link to the quiz. Please don't feel pressure. It's not an evaluation of your performance. It really is a training tool. So I'd encourage you to take that, see if there are any areas where you need to do some additional reading or you need to rewatch a video or anything like that. Just see if there are any gaps in your knowledge. But once you pass that quiz with 85% or more, then you and I will talk about getting you on a shift. So thanks once again, and I look forward to working with you more in a little bit.